The great hall on Kepler Prime was filled with beings from across the galaxy, and the air hummed with the sound of many different languages being translated into words that everyone could understand, and Elder Zixthara stood at the center of it, all with her body made of living crystal that had seen 3 million years pass by, while civilizations rose and fell around her, and today she had news that made her ancient heart feel heavy with worry, because she knew what was coming, even if nobody else would listen to her warnings. The Galactic Council had representatives from 57 different worlds, and they all thought they knew everything there was to know about war and conquest and power. But Elder Zixthara had lived long, enough to see patterns that others missed, and she had seen what happened when people ignored the signs that meant danger was coming their way. And today she was going to try one more time to make them understand what they were about to face. Admiral Krex of the Droken Empire was the largest being in the room, and his thick green skin was covered with scars from 100 battles, and he had conquered 12 star systems in the last 10 years alone, and when he laughed, it sounded like rocks grinding together, and he thought that nothing in the galaxy could stand against his mighty fleets and advanced weapons and trained soldiers, who had never known defeat in any war they had fought. Commander Veltar represented the Nexus Federation, and his body was like a giant octopus with tentacles that moved in the air while he spoke, and his people controlled trade routes across 40 different systems, and they had technology that could move planets if they wanted to, and they had never met a species that could resist their economic power combined with their military might, and he was already planning how to use these new humans as cheap labor in their mining operations. The Elder raised one of her crystal arms, and the room became quiet, because even though many of them thought she was too old and worried about things that did not matter, they still respected the fact that her people had survived longer than any other known species in the galaxy, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of all those years and all the things she had seen happen to civilizations that thought they were too strong to fall. She told them about the reports that had come from the Outer Rim territories, where scout ships had detected a new species that had just learned how to travel faster than light, and they called themselves humans, and they came from a small blue planet in a system that most people had never heard of, and they seemed like just another primitive race that would either join the galactic community or be absorbed by one of the major powers, like so many others before them. But Elder Zixthara knew something that the others did not know, because her people kept records that went back millions of years. And in those ancient files, there were mentions of these humans from long ago, when they were still trapped on their home world, and even then they had shown qualities that made the Vorthic observers write down warnings about what might happen if this species ever reached the stars. The Elder told the Council about how humans fought in wars on their own planet, and how they never seemed to give up even when they were outnumbered and outgunned and facing certain death, and how they would find ways to win battles that should have been impossible to win, and how they treated survival not as a goal, but as a requirement that they would meet no matter what the cost might be to themselves or their enemies. Admiral Krex interrupted her with his grinding laugh and said that every primitive species thought they were fierce warriors until they met real military power, and he had personally overseen the conquest of races that had similar reputations for stubbornness, and they all surrendered or died just like any other enemy when faced with superior technology and overwhelming numbers, and he was already planning how many ships he would need to bring these humans into line. Commander Veltar agreed and moved his tentacles in patterns that showed amusement, and said that his people had economic records showing that every species eventually chose wealth and comfort over pointless resistance, and that humans would be no different once they saw what the galactic community could offer them in exchange for cooperation and submission to the established order of things. But the Elder continued her warning and told them about the Kethmori hegemony that had controlled 40 star systems and possessed technology It was centuries ahead of anything the humans had when they first left their home world 30 years ago, and the Kethmori had been confident that they could easily deal with these newcomers who barely understood the basics of space travel and had weapons that seemed like toys compared to what advanced civilizations could build. The room became quieter as she spoke because some of the council members had heard rumors about what happened to the Kethmori, but none of them had believed the stories could be true, and Elder Zixthara continued in her ancient voice that carried sadness for all the warnings that had been ignored throughout history. And she told them that the Kethmori hegemony no longer existed, and their 40 systems now flew human. Flags and their advanced technology had been captured or destroyed, and their mighty fleets were nothing but wreckage floating in space. She explained that the war had lasted only 5 years, and the humans had started with just a few dozen ships that any major power would have considered insignificant, but they had fought in ways that the Kethmori could not understand or counter. And they had used tactics that seemed impossible, and they had turned their weaknesses into strengths, and their desperation into a weapon that cut through enemy defenses like they were made of paper. The humans had not fought to control territory or capture resources like normal civilizations did in their wars, and they had not tried to force surrender through demonstrations of superior firepower, and they had not offered terms for peace or negotiated for better conditions, and instead they had fought as if the survival of their entire species depended on winning every single battle, and they had made it clear that they would rather die than submit to foreign rule. Admiral Krex was no longer laughing, and his scarred face showed the first signs of concern as he asked how a primitive species could possibly defeat an advanced civilization. And Elder Zixthara explained that humans did not fight like other species because they did not think like other species, and when they were cornered, they became more dangerous, and when they faced impossible odds, they found impossible solutions, and when their enemies thought they had won, the humans would reveal that the real battle had not even started yet. She told the council that human ships had rammed Kethmori dreadnoughts in suicide attacks that took out vessels 100 times their size, and human soldiers had infiltrated enemy positions by hiding among their own dead, and human commanders had used their own planets as bait in traps that destroyed entire enemy fleets. And in the Mai, and the Kethmori had simply run out of ships and soldiers and will to fight, while the humans seemed to have an endless supply of all three. Commander Veltar asked why the Elder was telling them this story, and she replied that intelligence reports showed human ships were already exploring the edges of known space and making contact with smaller civilizations, and it was only a matter of time before they encountered one of the major powers, and when that happened, the galaxy would see a war unlike anything that had come before. The Elder made her final warning clear and simple, and told the assembled representatives that humans did not fight to win battles, because winning battles was just a step toward their real goal, and their real goal was survival of their species, and any being that threatened that survival would discover that humans could find ways to fight that nobody else had ever imagined, and they would use weapons that nobody else would use, and they would make sacrifices that nobody else would make. But the council had heard enough, and they voted to classify this as just another primitive species that would be dealt with through standard procedures, and they assigned the humans a threat level of minimal, and they scheduled them for contact and evaluation by whichever major power reached them first, and they ignored Elder Zixthara's final words that some warnings should be listened to before it was too late to matter. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UNS Liberty and watched the stars through the main view screen while his ship traveled through space toward what would be humanity's first official meeting with the galactic community, and he had been chosen for this mission because he was a former Marine who had fought in the Martian independence war, and the politicians thought that his military background would help him deal with whatever they might find out there among the alien civilizations? Liberty was not a warship, but it was armed with the best weapons that Earth could build, and it carried a crew of 43 men and women who had volunteered for this dangerous mission, knowing that they might never see home again, and Jake had trained with all of them, and he trusted them to do their jobs no matter what happened when they finally made contact with beings from other worlds. Lieutenant Amy Harper was monitoring the communication systems, and she had been working on learning the basic alien languages that Earth scientists had figured out from intercepted transmissions, and she was recording everything that happened so that the information could be sent back to Earth through the quantum entanglement communicators. That would work no matter how far they traveled from home. Sergeant Dan Tucker was in charge of the ship's weapons, and he had been a soldier for 15 years before joining this mission, and he knew that their guns were probably not much compared to what advanced alien civilizations might have, but he also knew that sometimes the willingness to fight was more important than having the biggest weapons, and he was ready to defend his ship and crew if things went wrong. Chief Engineer Pete Collins was keeping the engines running, and he had been designing new modifications ever since they left Earth because he believed that human engineering could surprise aliens who thought they knew everything about technology, and he had some ideas about what could be done with their fusion reactor if they ever needed to make a statement that nobody could ignore. The mission had been planned for months, and Earth's leaders had chosen Jake Morrison to represent humanity because he understood that sometimes diplomacy required the threat of force, and he had orders to be peaceful but firm, and to make it clear that humans would not accept being treated as inferior beings just because they were new to space travel when the Droken fleet appeared. On their sensors, Jake knew immediately that this was not going to be the friendly first contact that the politicians had hoped for, and 12 massive alien ships surrounded the Liberty like predators circling prey, and their weapons were powered up, and targeting systems were locked onto the human vessel. Admiral Krex's voice came through the communication system, and it sounded like gravel being crushed under heavy boots, and he spoke in the common galactic language that Amy Harper had been studying, and his words were translated by the ship's computer so that everyone could understand what he was saying to them. The alien commander told them that they would surrender immediately, and that humanity was now property of the Droken Empire, and that if they cooperated, their deaths would be quick and painless, but if they resisted, they would suffer before they died. And Jake Morrison listened to these words while looking at the tactical display that showed how badly outnumbered they were. Amy Harper was recording everything and transmitting the data back to Earth through channels that the aliens probably did not know existed, and Dan Tucker was checking his weapons, even though they both knew that the Liberty's guns could not fight 12 enemy dreadnoughts, and Chief Collins was quietly preparing something in the engine room that none of them had talked about, but all of them understood. Jake Morrison had fought in wars before, and he knew the difference between battles that could be won and battles that had to be fought anyway, and this was clearly the second kind, because these aliens had not come here to negotiate or to welcome humanity into their galactic community, and they had come here to demonstrate that humans were weak and helpless and would submit to alien authority. The captain opened a communication channel to Admiral Krex and spoke in a calm voice that showed no fear, even though he knew that his ship and crew were probably about to die. And he told the alien commander that he appreciated the warm welcome, but that they were going to have to decline his generous offer of surrender. And Slavery Admiral Krex was confused by this response, because in his experience, primitive species either gave up immediately when faced with overwhelming force, or they died quickly while making futile gestures of defiance, and he had never encountered a species that would calmly refuse surrender, while clearly understanding that they were about to be destroyed. Jake Morrison looked around his bridge and saw the faces of men and women who had volunteered to represent their species among the stars, and he knew that they understood what was about to happen, and he knew that they were ready too. Send a message that would be remembered by everyone who heard the story of humanity's first contact with alien civilization. The captain told Admiral Krex that humans had a saying about how, in any fight, you could define victory on your own terms, and that sometimes winning meant making sure that your enemy paid a price for attacking you, and that even if you could not survive, you could still make them remember what it cost to threaten your people before the alien commander could respond. Jake Morrison gave orders that changed everything, and the Liberty accelerated directly toward the largest Droken dreadnought, while Chief Collins triggered modifications to their fusion reactor that would turn their ship into a weapon that no alien had ever seen before. The human vessel moved like it was being piloted by someone who was not afraid of death, and the aliens realized too late that these newcomers did not fight according to the rules that other species followed, and they did not try to escape when they were outnumbered, and they did not beg for mercy when they faced superior firepower. The explosion that followed destroyed both the Liberty and the alien dreadnought, and the electromagnetic pulse from their modified reactor disabled 3 more Droken ships and sent a shockwave through space that could be detected by sensors across the star system. Jake Morrison's final transmission was recorded by Amy Harper and sent to Earth before the ship was destroyed, and his last words were heard by billions of humans who learned that their representatives among the stars had died fighting rather than surrendering, and that they had made alien aggressors pay a price for threatening humanity. The message reached Earth within hours through quantum communication, and it said that Captain Morrison and his crew had been there, and that they had fought, and that they were coming, and these simple words became a rallying cry for a species that had just learned that the galaxy was not a safe place for peaceful explorers. Admiral Krex survived the battle, but his pride and confidence were shattered because he had expected easy victory over primitives, and instead he had lost 4 ships to opponents who should not have been able to harm his mighty fleet, and he realized that these humans were unlike any enemy he had ever faced. Other alien commanders who heard about the battle were disturbed by reports that described humans who fought like they had nothing to lose, and who used tactics that seemed designed by madmen, and who treated their own deaths as acceptable costs for inflicting damage on their enemies. News of the Liberty's destruction spread through alien communication networks, and beings who had never heard of humans before began to whisper about a species that would ram dreadnoughts with courier ships, and who would detonate their own reactors to take enemies with them, and who sent messages promising that more of them were coming. Elder Zixthara received the reports about first contact, and she felt the weight of millions of years pressing down on her crystal form, because she had seen this pattern before, and she knew that the galaxy was about to learn why her people had written warnings about humans in records that were older than most civilizations. The Droken Empire began preparing for war against an enemy they did not understand, and Admiral Krex sent reports to his government describing opponents who fought without regard for their own survival, and who seemed to view death in battle as victory rather than defeat, and who had technology that could be weaponized in ways that military strategists had never considered. But none of the alien powers truly understood what they had started, because they thought of the Liberty as a single ship destroyed in a minor skirmish, and they did not realize that they had just declared war on a species that would treat the death of 43 volunteers as an attack on all of humanity that demanded total response. President Helen Martinez stood before the United Earth Assembly while holographic displays showed the positions of alien fleets gathering at the edges of human space, and the faces of the representatives from every nation on Earth showed anger and determination, because they had all heard the recording of Captain Morrison's final transmission, and they understood that humanity was now at war, whether they wanted it or not. The news of the Liberty's destruction had reached Earth through quantum communication. channels that the aliens did not know existed, and within hours, every human on the planet had heard how their first ambassadors to the stars had died fighting against enemies who demanded surrender and slavery, and the response was immediate and unified in a way that had never happened before. In human history, General Carl Bennett stood beside the president, and his weathered face showed the expression of a soldier who had seen too many wars, but who understood that this one was different, because this time humanity was not fighting over territory or resources or political differences, and this time they were fighting for the right to exist as a free species among the stars. The general explained to the assembly that alien civilizations had made a fundamental mistake in their understanding of human nature, because they thought that destroying one ship would demonstrate their power and convince humanity to submit, but instead they had awakened something that had been sleeping in the human soul since the first cave dweller picked up a rock to defend his family. Dr. Lisa Chun was the leading physicist on Earth, and she had been working on theoretical weapons that could be built using human technology and manufacturing capabilities, and she told the assembly that aliens might have superior individual ships, but they had never seen what humans could accomplish when they turned their entire industrial civilization toward a single goal within days. Of the Liberty's destruction, every factory on Earth was retooled for war production, and shipyards that had been building cargo vessels and passenger liners began constructing warships designed around principles that no alien military strategist had ever considered, and human engineers worked around the clock to turn their weaknesses into advantages. Captain Roy Adams was given command of the first human battle fleet, and his flagship was the Unz's Vengeance, which had been designed to honor the memory of Jake Morrison and his crew, and the ship was built for speed and firepower rather than the heavy armor that alien dreadnoughts relied on, because humans had decided that the best defense was to hit the enemy so hard and so fast that they could not fight back. The human approach to space warfare was based on lessons learned from centuries of conflict on Earth, and they understood that superior numbers and technology meant nothing if your enemy was willing to take risks that you would never consider, and if they could find ways to turn your advantages against you. Roy Adams had served in the Earth Defense Force for 20 years, and he had studied every battle that humans had ever fought, and he knew that the key to victory was not having better weapons, but being willing to use whatever weapons you had in ways that your enemy did not expect and could not counter. The first test of human military doctrine came when a Drokin patrol of 30 ships encountered Adams and his fleet of 12 vessels near Wolf 359, and the aliens expected to repeat their easy victory over the Liberty, but instead they found themselves facing opponents who had learned from that sacrifice and who were ready to show the galaxy what happened when you threatened humanity. The battle began when the Drokin commander demanded surrender, and Captain Adams responded by ordering his ships to attack immediately without warning or negotiation, because humans had decided that aliens who killed their diplomats did not deserve the courtesy of formal declarations of war. Human ships moved in ways that violated every principle of space combat that alien military academies taught their officers, and they used swarm tactics with multiple small vessels coordinating attacks on single large targets, and they employed weapons that had been improvised from civilian technology, and they fought with a ferocity that the aliens had never encountered. The UN's Vengeance led the attack by accelerating directly at the largest enemy ship, while the rest of the human fleet scattered in all directions and began hit-and-run attacks that prevented the aliens from concentrating their firepower, and the Drokin commander realized too late that he was fighting an enemy that did not follow the rules of civilized warfare. Human ships rammed alien vessels when their weapons ran out of ammunition, and human crews detonated their reactors when their ships were too damaged to continue fighting, and human captains used their own vessels as bait to draw enemies into traps that had been prepared by their squadmatists. battle lasted 6 hours, and when it was over, all 30 alien ships had been destroyed or disabled, while humanity had lost. Only 2 vessels, and the survivors were rescued by their comrades, who never left anyone behind if there was any chance of saving them, Commander. Rita Lopez was monitoring alien communications from deep space reconnaissance ships that had been positioned throughout the sector, and she reported that panic was spreading through alien military networks as news of the human victory reached other civilizations. The word human was becoming synonymous with concepts that alien languages had no direct translations. For because no other species had ever fought wars the way the humans fought them, and alien commanders were struggling to develop strategies against opponents who seemed to view their own deaths as acceptable tactical options, Admiral Steve Harrison was given overall command of human military forces, and he began planning operations that would carry the war directly to alien territory. Because humanity had decided that the best way to prevent future attacks on Earth was to make it clear that threatening humans would result in immediate and overwhelming retaliation. Harrison had been studying alien psychology and military doctrine, and he understood that most galactic civilizations fought wars for economic or territorial gain, and they surrendered when the cost of continuing became greater than the potential benefits. But humans were fighting for survival, and they would never surrender as long as their species existed. The Admiral sent a message to every alien civilization in the galaxy, and his words were translated into hundreds of languages and broadcast on communication frequencies that reached across thousands of star systems, and the message was simple and direct and left no room for misunderstanding. He told them that aliens had come to human space and killed human people and threatened human worlds, and that now they would learn why the ancient elders had warned them about humanity, and that every species that had participated in or supported attacks on humans would face the consequences of their actions. Earth's shipyards were working at maximum capacity, and new vessels were being launched every day, while human colonies throughout the solar system contributed resources and personnel to the war effort, and volunteers lined up at recruitment centers, because every human understood that this was not just another war, but a fight for the future of their species. Dr. Kevin Wright led research teams that were developing weapons based on human engineering principles rather than trying to copy alien technology, and they created kinetic bombardment systems that used asteroids as projectiles and swarm missiles that could overwhelm enemy defenses, and electromagnetic pulse weapons that could disable entire fleets. The aliens had started this war expecting to face primitive opponents with inferior technology and limited resources, but instead they found themselves fighting an entire species that had united behind a single purpose, and that was willing to sacrifice everything to ensure that humanity would survive and thrive among the stars. Human fleets began penetrating deep into alien territory, and they used tactics that had been developed through centuries of warfare on Earth. And they showed no mercy to enemies who had shown no mercy to the crew of the Liberty. And they left messages for other species to find that explained why humanity was fighting this war. Galaxy was learning that humans did not fight like other civilizations because they did not think like other civilizations, and when they were threatened, they did not calculate the odds of victory before deciding whether to resist, and they did not negotiate for better terms of surrender because they had already decided that surrender was not an option. Elder Zixthara watched the reports coming in from across the galaxy, and she felt sadness for all the species that had ignored her warnings, because she knew that this was only the beginning, and that humans would not stop fighting until they had eliminated every threat to their existence, or until they had died trying the ancient. Vorthik had seen this pattern before in the long history of the galaxy, and they knew that when a species fought for survival rather than conquest, they became capable of things that more civilized beings could not imagine, and that was why her people had written warnings about humans millions of years ago when they were still confined to a single world. But now it was too late for warnings, because the humans were no longer confined to anything, and they were coming for everyone who had threatened them. And they would not stop until the galaxy understood that some species should never be awakened from their peaceful slumber. Admiral Rachel Torres stood on the bridge of the UNS Retribution and coordinated simultaneous attacks on 17 different star systems, while her flagship led a fleet of over 200 human vessels that had been built in the 6 months since the destruction of the Liberty, and the aliens could not believe that a primitive species could construct so many warships in such a short time. The galaxy was in chaos because human fleets had penetrated deep into alien territory using tactics that no military academy had ever taught, and strategies that seemed to have been designed by beings who understood war in ways that civilized species had forgotten, and every day brought new reports of alien defeats and human victories that should have been impossible. Rachel Torres had worked her way up from enlisted ranks through 20 years of military service, and she understood that the key to defeating superior forces was to never fight the kind of battle that your enemy expected, and to always attack where they thought they were safe, and to make them afraid of every shadow in space. Her fleet was armed with weapons that Dr. Kevin Wright's research teams had developed specifically for fighting alien dreadnoughts, and they included kinetic penetrators that could punch through any armor, and electromagnetic pulse generators that could disable entire enemy fleets, and swarm missiles that turned space battles into storms of destruction that no defense could stop. The UNS Retribution itself was a symbol of human determination because it had been built using salvaged alien technology that had been captured in previous battles and improved with human engineering methods that focused on reliability and effectiveness rather than showing off advanced capabilities to impress other species. Captain Michelle Roberts was leading a daring assault on the Nexus Federation home world of Velanara, and her ships were threading through orbital defenses that the aliens had thought were impregnable because no civilized species would risk their vessels in such a dangerous approach. But humans had learned that the word impossible was just another tactical challenge to overcome. The Nexus Federation had controlled trade routes across 40 star systems for thousands of years, and they had technology that could move planets and weapons that could destroy stars, but they had never faced an enemy that would use their own defense satellites as cover while attacking their most heavily fortified positions. Michelle Roberts had been a test pilot before the war started, and she understood how to push ships beyond their design limits and how to make maneuvers that safety regulations said were suicidal, but that could give her the advantage she needed against enemies who followed predictable patterns of engagement. Ships moved through the Velanara defense grid like dancers performing a deadly ballet, and they used the planet's own fortifications as shields while they targeted critical systems and communication nodes and power generators that kept the entire defensive network functioning. The aliens watched in horror as human vessels appeared where their sensors said nothing could survive and disappeared before their weapons could lock on, and reappeared somewhere else to continue attacks that seemed random, but that were actually part of a coordinated plan that was reducing their mighty fortress world to helpless prey. Colonel Nathan Brooks was commanding ground operations on worlds that had been occupied by alien forces, and he was liberating human prisoners who had been captured in earlier battles and alien slaves who had been working in mining operations and manufacturing facilities that supported the war effort against humanity. Nathan Brooks had been a special forces operator for 15 years, and he had trained for missions behind enemy lines, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for fighting on alien worlds against opponents who had completely different ideas about warfare and combat and the rules that governed military operations. His soldiers fought with equipment that had been designed for human physiology and tactics that had been developed for human psychology, and they showed a ferocity that alien species had never encountered because they were fighting to rescue their own people and to free beings who had been enslaved by enemies who considered them property. The ground war was different from space. Battles because it required face-to-face combat with aliens who were stronger or faster or more numerous than humans, but who had never learned to fight, against opponents who had sacrificed themselves to complete their missions and who treated retreat as a temporary tactical maneuver rather than a mission to defeat human soldiers, used weapons that alien armor had not been designed to stop, and they employed strategies that alien commanders had never studied in their military academies. And they demonstrated that superior technology meant nothing against opponents who understood that the will to fight was more important than having better equipment. The turning point in the war came when Elder Zixthara herself requested a meeting with Admiral Torres because the ancient Vorthik had watched the pattern of human expansion, and she knew that something terrible was approaching that would threaten the survival of every species in the galaxy. The Elder arrived at the edge of the fun Sol system aboard a neutral vessel that flew under diplomatic protection, and her crystalline form was dimmed with what humans had learned to recognize as fear, because even beings who had lived for millions of years could feel terror when they saw the future clearly. Admiral Torres met with Elder Zixthara in a conference room aboard a human space station that had been built from captured alien materials, and the two beings who represented the oldest and newest civilizations in the galaxy faced each other across a table while the fate of countless worlds hung in the balance. The Elder warned Admiral Torres that the major powers were forming an alliance that would include every species and every fleet and every weapon they possessed, because they had decided that humanity posed such a threat to the established order that Earth itself must be destroyed rather than allow human expansion to continue. She explained that 3,000 ships from 47 different species were gathering for an assault on the human home world, and that they possessed technology spanning millions of years of development, and that their combined firepower could turn planets into molten slag and star systems into empty space. Admiral Torres listened to this warning while studying the alien Elder who had risked everything to bring this information to humanity, and she understood that this ancient being was trying to prevent a catastrophe that would destroy both humans and aliens and leave the galaxy empty of intelligent life. The Admiral told Elder Zixthara that she appreciated the warning, but that the aliens had made the same mistake that everyone else had made because they thought humans would wait for their enemies to come to them and fight a defensive battle that followed conventional military doctrine. She explained that Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been working on something called the Terra Protocol, and that if aliens wanted to threaten Earth directly, they would discover that humans had prepared one final surprise that would demonstrate why some species should never be pushed beyond their limits. Elder asked what the Terra Protocol involved, and Admiral Torres smiled with an expression that contained both sadness and determination, because she knew that the next phase of the war would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, and that when it was over, the balance of power among the stars would be changed forever. The Admiral explained that humans had spent the months since the Liberty's destruction preparing for exactly this situation, and that they had learned from studying alien psychology and military doctrine, and they understood that most galactic civilizations could not imagine fighting a war that threatened their home worlds and core territories. She told the Elder that alien species fought wars for profit or territory or political advantage, but they always assumed that their enemies shared the same limitations and the same reluctance to risk everything in pursuit of victory, and they could not understand opponents who viewed total war as the only acceptable response to existential threats. The conversation between Admiral Torres and Elder Zixthara was recorded and transmitted to every human fleet in the galaxy, and within hours captains and crews throughout human space received orders that activated the final phase of their species' response to alien aggression. Human ships began moving toward alien home worlds, not to conquer them, but to demonstrate that threatening Earth would result in immediate retaliation against every species that had participated in the Grand Alliance, and that humanity would make the cost of victory so high that nobody would ever again consider attacking human territory. The galaxy was about to learn that humans did not just fight to defend themselves, and they did not limit their warfare to military targets, and they did not negotiate for peace when their survival was at stake, and they would use any weapon and employ any tactic and make any sacrifice that was necessary to ensure that their species would continue to exist among the stars. Elder Zixthara left the meeting knowing that she had done everything possible to prevent the coming catastrophe, but also understanding that some forces could not be stopped once they had been set in motion, and that the galaxy would soon witness the final demonstration of why her people had written warnings about humans in records that were older than most civilizations. The Grand Alliance fleet that assembled at the edge of the Sol system was the largest military force in galactic history, and 3,000 ships from 47 different species hung in space, like a cloud of death that stretched across millions of kilometers, while Admiral Krex commanded vessels that represented technology spanning millions of years of development and weapons that could crack planets and turn star systems into graveyards the alien commanders had expected to find Earth, defended by whatever remained of the human fleet after months of warfare. But instead, they found the Sol system apparently empty except for a single small ship that was broadcasting on all frequencies and transmitting a message that seemed to come from the human leadership itself. President Helen Martinez sat in the command chair of the courier vessel UNS Messenger, and she was flanked by a small crew that included Captain Tony Williams and Communications Officer Lavra Kim, and behind her the seemingly empty space around Earth concealed humanity's final surprise that had been prepared according to Dr. Sarah Mitchell's Terra Protocol. The President opened a communication channel to the Grand Alliance fleet, and her voice carried across space to reach beings from dozens of different worlds who had come to destroy humanity's home world because they believed that overwhelming numbers would succeed where strategy and superior technology had failed. She told Admiral Krex and his allies that they had come to Earth to end the human species because they could not defeat human fleets in open battle, and that they believed massive firepower would accomplish what military skill and tactical superiority had not been able to achieve. Admiral Krex responded with hatred in his voice because he had been the first alien commander to encounter humans, and he had lost ships and crews to opponents who fought in ways that violated every principle of civilized warfare, and he wanted revenge for the humiliation that humanity had inflicted on his mighty empire. The alien commander told President Martinez that her species would end today, and that if she surrendered immediately, he would grant her people quick deaths instead of the prolonged suffering that they deserved for daring to resist the will of superior civilizations who had ruled the galaxy for millions of years. President Martinez smiled, and her expression was visible to every ship in the Grand Alliance fleet because she wanted them to see her face when she delivered humanity's final message to the species that had threatened Earth and killed human crews and declared war on a people who had only wanted to join the galactic community in peace. She told Admiral Krex that he had spent months fighting human military forces, but that he had never fought the entire human species, and that now she would introduce him to the Terra Protocol, which would demonstrate why Elder Zixthara had tried to warn the galaxy about what happened when humans were pushed beyond their limits on her signal. Earth's moon split open like a flower blooming in space, and what the aliens had believed was Luna revealed itself as humanity's greatest construction project that had been built over decades of preparation, using techniques that no other species had ever attempted. 10,000 ships emerged from concealment inside the moon, and each vessel was crewed by volunteers from across human space who had trained for this moment when they would defend their home world against enemies who thought that numbers and firepower were more important than determination and courage, but the hidden fleet was not the real surprise, because Dr. Mitchell's true innovation was the weaponization of Earth's entire solar system, using methods that turned civilian infrastructure into military assets and peaceful installations into weapons of war that could destroy entire enemy fleets. The asteroids that aliens had assumed were natural phenomena were revealed as positioned kinetic weapons that could be launched at targets anywhere in the system, and the solar collectors that humanity had built for energy production were focused beam weapons that could cut through any armor that alien technology could create. Even Earth's orbital habitats and space stations had been armed with weapons that had been disguised as industrial equipment and mining platforms and communication arrays, and every human installation in the Sol system became part of a coordinated defense network that turned the entire star system into a fortress. Captain Janet Phillips commanded the flagship Unstoppable, and she led humanity's reserve fleet that consisted of veterans from every battle since first contact, and each ship carried the names of the fallen from the Liberty inscribed on their hulls as a reminder of why they were fighting this war. Battle that followed lasted 3 days, and it was unlike anything that had ever been fought in the history of galactic civilization, because the humans did not try to defend fixed positions or preserve their infrastructure, and instead they turned their entire solar system into a weapon that was aimed at the heart of the Grand Alliance fleet. Human ships attacked in waves that never stopped coming, and they used tactics that had been developed through months of warfare against alien opponents, and they demonstrated that they had learned from every defeat and every victory and every sacrifice that their species had made. Since leaving Earth, the aliens found themselves fighting not just against human fleets, but against the solar system itself, as asteroids accelerated toward their ships, and focused energy beams cut through their formations, and kinetic weapons struck them from directions that should have been empty. Space Admiral Krex watched his mighty alliance dissolve under attacks that came from everywhere at once, and he realized too late that humans had turned their weakness into strength by making their entire civilization into a military asset that could not be defeated by conventional warfare. The Grand Alliance fleet was designed to fight other civilizations that followed the established rules of galactic warfare, and they could not adapt to opponents who had thrown away the rules and replaced them with strategies that treated survival as the only goal that they mattered. Human crews fought with a desperation that alien species could not understand, because they were defending not just their ships or their fleets, but their whole world and their families and their entire future as a species that would exist among the stars. A battle ended 3 days later. The Grand Alliance fleet had been completely destroyed, and not a single alien vessel escaped to carry word of their defeat, because humanity had learned that sometimes you had to eliminate threats completely to prevent them from returning with reinforcements. Admiral Torres stood in the ruins of Admiral Krex's flagship and faced the captured alien commander whose pride and confidence had been shattered by his encounter with opponents who fought wars in ways that his military academy had never taught him. Krex asked why humans fought so hard for worlds they barely knew and for species they had never met, and Admiral Torres looked out at the stars where human ships were already heading toward alien home worlds to establish the new order that would govern the galaxy. She told the alien admiral that he had threatened humanity's home, and that humans who fought for their homes did not lose because they survived and adapted and overcame every obstacle, and they never gave up as long as their species continued to exist. The admiral explained that humans had not wanted this war, but that they had been willing to fight it once it became necessary, and that they had demonstrated to the galaxy that some species should not be awakened from their peaceful existence, because when they were threatened, they became capable of things that more civilized beings could not imagine. As news of the Grand Alliance's destruction spread across the galaxy, Elder Zixthara's final Transmission echoed through alien communication networks, and her ancient voice carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled when she reminded every species that she had warned them. About humans, she told the galaxy that the elders had warned them that humans were unstoppable, and that no one had heeded those warnings, and that now they knew why some advice should be listened to before it was too late to matter, and why some species should never be pushed beyond their limits. The age of human expansion had begun, and ships carrying the flag of Earth were spreading across the galaxy to establish colonies and trading posts and military bases that would ensure that humanity would never again be threatened by alien civilizations who thought that being primitive meant being helpless. The galaxy would never be the same, because humans had demonstrated that technological superiority and numerical advantage meant nothing against opponents who were willing to sacrifice everything to protect their freedom and their right to exist as equals among the stars. Other species began to understand that the rules of galactic civilization had changed, and that humanity represented a new kind of power that was based not on ancient technology or vast fleets, but on the simple fact that some beings would fight for their survival with methods that more civilized species would never use. Warnings had been given and ignored, and now the galaxy would live with the consequences of threatening a species that viewed extinction as unacceptable, and that would use any weapon and employ any tactic and make any sacrifice that was necessary to ensure that their children would inherit the stars.